It was June 5th, 1967. In his palace in Amman, Jordan's King Hussein was on edge. Just then, a message arrived from Gamal Abdel Nasser, Egypt's leader, claiming Egyptian forces had annihilated Israel's air force. Victory, he said, was imminent. Believing his trusted ally, Hussein ordered his troops into the fight. But just hours later, Hussein realized a devastating truth. Nasser had lied. Egypt's air force was in ruins, and by joining the war, Jordan had walked into a trap. It lost Jerusalem and the West Bank, resulting in thousands of deaths and the start of the Arab-Israel War. But here's what Hussein didn't know at the time, and what changes everything about this story. Nasser's lie wasn't just a desperate act. It was part of a psychological pattern that had been embedded into the very foundation of the Arab world nearly a century earlier. What most people don't realize is that every major betrayal in Arab politics follows the same pattern. A pattern that was designed by European colonial powers who didn't just draw lines on a map. They created what can only be described as a betrayal blueprint. And once you see this pattern, you literally cannot unsee it. After the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the early 1900s, Britain and France didn't randomly carve up the Middle East. They engineered a psychological trap. With the Sykes Picot Agreement, they created borders that would guarantee conflict, forcing ancient enemies together while splitting natural allies apart. These artificial borders trapped people and resources and created what psychologists call manufactured scarcity. When you force nations to compete for survival on land they believe is stolen, and then ensure their neighbor controls the water and oil, you create a system where betrayal becomes a survival mechanism. And this is where the pattern gets truly disturbing. The immense oil wealth of the Gulf states breeds resentment among their poorer neighbors. Iraq's brutal invasion of Kuwait in 1990 wasn't just about greed. It was the inevitable result of this manufactured scarcity system. The feeling of have and have not poisoned relationships, turning potential partners into existential rivals. But there's another layer to this betrayal blueprint that most people completely miss. Beneath the wars about borders and wealth lies an even deeper division that leaders have learned to weaponize for their own survival. The split between Sunni and Shia Islam that goes back nearly 1,400 years. On one side stands Sunni-led Saudi Arabia, on the other, Shia-led Iran. They see each other as existential threats, and their rivalry plays out in devastating proxy wars across the region. In 2015, Saudi Arabia began bombing Houthi rebels in Yemen, not just because they were a threat, but because they were backed by Iran. The conflict turned Yemen into a graveyard, a sacrifice in a larger geopolitical chess match. But here's what reveals the true psychological trap. Even among Sunni powers, trust is paper thin. In 2017, Saudi Arabia and the UAE launched a blockade against Qatar, accusing it of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Alliances shift like desert sands, all in a desperate game of regime survival. When a leader's #1 priority is holding on to power, they will betray anyone to keep it. And this brings us back to that day in June 1967, because Nasser's lie to Hussein wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a pattern that proves leaders deceive to survive. In 1973, during another war with Israel, Egypt's Anwar Sadat concealed his true battle plans from Syrian allies, leaving them exposed to suffer heavy losses. Sadat prioritized limited political gains over total victory, ultimately aiming for separate peace negotiations that would return the Sinai Peninsula while securing his regime's survival. Then came the Arab Spring in 2011. Saudi Arabia and the UAE backed a military coup in Egypt to crush the elected Muslim Brotherhood government, while Qatar supported the Brotherhood. Hope for a new era quickly dissolved into the same old chaos and mistrust. But here's where this pattern becomes truly heartbreaking. Even the Palestinian cause, supposedly a unifier of the Arab world, is riddled with this same fear. While leaders voice support in public, their actions show deep suspicion. Haunted by past conflicts with Palestinian factions, Arab states always offer Palestinians words but never refuge. This instinct for self-preservation ensures that national interest always comes before collective trust. Today, this long and bitter history manifests in a series of brutal proxy wars. Instead of fighting each other directly, regional powers back, opposing sides in other nations' civil wars, turning countries like Syria, Libya, and Yemen into permanent battlegrounds. In Libya, the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia backed one warlord, while Turkey and Qatar backed the government in Tripoli. In Syria, Iran props up Bashar al-Assad's regime, while Saudi Arabia and Turkey armed the rebels trying to overthrow him. This game continues to slaughter lives, drain funds, and destroy peace. But while soldiers and militias fight on the ground, another, quieter war is being waged in boardrooms and banks, an economic war fueled by the very same psychological trap. Trade between Arab countries is stunningly low because the same manufactured mistrust poisons every deal. Businesses stick to their own, and investors are scared away by political instability. Nations with shared enemies still can't cooperate if their economic goals compete. Here's a perfect example of how deep this programming goes. In Yemen, Saudi Arabia and the UAE are supposed allies fighting the same war, but their objectives clash. The UAE wants to control strategic ports for trade, while Saudi Arabia focuses on border security. They're fighting the same enemy, but for different prizes. This rivalry ensures that even when opportunities for mutual prosperity arise, they are lost to the betrayal blueprint embedded in their political DNA. And in the middle of these grand games of power, played by leaders with maps, money, and militias, it's easy to forget who pays the ultimate price. It's not the kings or presidents. It's the millions of ordinary people whose lives are destroyed in the process. The human cost is immeasurable. Families torn from their homes, children starving, an entire generation growing up in the ruins of their parents' world. The distrust is passed down from father to son, mother to daughter, becoming as much a part of their inheritance as their culture or faith. So with wounds this deep, with betrayals etched into collective memory and passed down through generations, is it even possible to imagine a future where these nations can trust one another? Rebuilding that trust seems impossible. The scars of colonial borders, the fire of sectarian hatred, the cold poison of political betrayal, and the constant hum of proxy wars all feed a cycle that feels unbreakable. Yet even in this landscape of despair, tiny glimmers of change appear. The Abraham Accords saw some Arab nations normalize relations with their longtime enemy, Israel, suggesting that old rivalries are not set in stone. Quiet diplomatic channels are opening to end the war in Yemen. These are small steps, and the path forward is fraught with peril. It requires a generation of leaders willing to be honest, to prioritize shared prosperity over personal power, and to finally break the psychological cycle of fear that was engineered over a century ago. Without that, the Arab world may remain a fractured family of nations, forever haunted by the ghosts of its own history and the betrayal blueprint that still controls their fate. If you liked this video, make sure you subscribe to State of Affairs, where we bring interesting geopolitical topics every week.